If you've ever taken an intro to psychology class, I can almost guarantee you've seen the model we're talking about today. It's the Atkinson Shiffrin multi-store model of memory. And for like half a century, it's been the first thing we all learn about how our memories actually work.
You know the one I'm talking about, right? That super neat three-box diagram. Information flows from sensory memory to short-term memory, and then, if you're lucky, it lands in long-term memory. It's clean, it makes sense, and it's how literally millions of us got our first peek inside the mind.
But here's the thing. What if that simple version you memorize for the test is just a sketch? What if the real, original theory from 1968 was way more complicated, way more nuanced, and honestly, way more modern than the textbook ever let on?
Okay, so before we get into the big reveal, let's do a super quick refresher on the version we all learned in school. This is probably going to sound really familiar, but stick with me, because you need this to understand just how big the plot twist really is.
So, everything kicks off with sensory memory. Think of it as this super brief, high-capacity holding area for all the stuff your senses are picking up. You know, like the ghost image of a sparkler in the air, or the echo of a clap just for a split second after it happens. That's your sensory memory. And poof, most of it is gone almost instantly. Now, if you actually pay attention to something in that sensory flood, it gets bumped up to your short-term memory. This is basically your brain's sticky note. It's where you hold a phone number right before you dial it. And it's tiny. Remember the magical number 7 plus or minus 2? That's the famous capacity limit. It doesn't hold things for very long either.
So how do you make things stick around? Well, according to the simple model, you just rehearse it. You repeat it over and over. That repetition is supposedly the ticket to long-term memory, the huge, seemingly endless library of your entire life. Your first bike ride, facts you learned, all your experiences, they all live here. So this little table sums up the textbook version perfectly. 3 different stores, each with its own capacity, duration, and how it encodes stuff. It's a nice, tidy, straight line. Information comes in, you pay attention, you rehearse it, and boom, it's stored forever. Simple, right? But is that the real story?
All right, here we go. This is the fun part. Let's peel back that simplified textbook diagram and look at what Atkinson and Shiffrin actually wrote in their original game-changing paper from 1968. I mean, did they really see memory as just this passive conveyor belt where memories just kind of roll along from one box to the next? Or was there a lot more going on that just got lost in translation over the decades?
Okay, check out this quote, because this is huge. The guys who created the model never meant for it to be the final answer. They literally called it a general framework. It was supposed to be a starting point, a foundation for other people to build on, not some rigid, unchanging law of memory.
And this slide just lays it all out. On the left, you've got the myth we all learned, one short-term memory bucket, filled up by simple repetition. But the reality on the right, from their actual paper, is so much cooler. They talked about multiple short-term stores, called STM and active working memory, and said getting things into long-term storage involved complex coding processes.
I mean, let's look at the proof. The idea of having different stores for different senses, that was there from the very beginning. They explicitly mention a short-term visual store, which is totally different from, say, an auditory one. That's a huge deal.
And then there's this. This is the bombshell, the phrase that would launch 1,000 research papers decades later. Working memory. Atkinson and Shiffrin used those exact words. Back in 1968, they didn't see short-term memory as just a passive shelf. They saw it as an active mental workbench where you actually do stuff with information.
They also knew that just repeating something mindlessly wasn't the best way to learn. They talked about these coding operations, which is basically what we now call elaborative rehearsal. It's the difference between chanting a definition over and over versus actually trying to connect it to something you already know. They were so ahead of their time.
So, the original model was incredibly deep, but why did they even propose separate short-term and long-term systems to begin with? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle came from one extraordinary man.
This is Henry Mollison, known to the world of science as Patient HM. His story is probably one of the most important case studies in the entire history of neuroscience, and his condition gave powerful, real-world evidence for this idea of separate memory stores.
So to cure his debilitating epilepsy, HM had a risky surgery that removed parts of his brain, including a structure called the hippocampus. And while the surgery did stop his seizures, it came with a shocking and tragic side effect that changed our understanding of memory forever.
After the surgery, HM couldn't form any new long-term memories. None.
He could have a conversation with you, but if you left the room and came back 5 minutes later, it would be like he'd never met you. But here's the crucial part. His short-term memory was perfectly fine. He could remember a string of numbers just like you or me. This was the smoking gun, proof that short-term and long-term memory were two different systems.
But of course, that's how science works. No theory is ever perfect. And as powerful as the multi-store model was, other researchers and other patients started to show some of the cracks in this framework.
So while HM seemed to fit the model perfectly, another case, patient KF, completely flipped the script. KF had a terrible short-term memory. He could only remember maybe 2 digits at a time. Now, according to the model's conveyor belt idea, this should have made it impossible for him to form new long-term memories, right? But his long-term memory worked just fine. So how is information getting to the long-term library if the short-term gateway was broken? It was a huge challenge to the model.
And the critiques didn't stop there. It became clear the model was just too simple. We now know that short-term memory is way more active, better described as working memory. And long-term memory isn't just one big box. It has different types, like memory for skills, like riding a bike, and memory for facts. Plus, the model put way too much emphasis on simple, boring repetition as the key to learning.
So where does that leave us? Was the multi-store model just wrong? Should we throw it out? Or is there another way to think about its place in history?
Just look at this number for a second. Over 11,000 citations. You don't get that many citations for a failed theory. No way. This shows just how incredibly influential it was. It wasn't the final answer, but it was the blueprint. It gave everyone the language and the basic structure to argue about, to test, and ultimately to build something even better.
So in the end, that simple diagram we all learned isn't the whole story, not by a long shot. The real theory was smarter, deeper, and way more prescient than it usually gets credit for. It wasn't the final destination, but it was the map that started the entire journey. And that just leaves us with a really exciting question. What secrets will the next generation of researchers unlock?